Hello everyone and welcome. It's lovely to see you all here tonight. So it's really lovely to have our second LCAB Christmas lecture, and to introduce the speaker I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Charlie Jeffrey, our VC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. I did say last year that it was good to be at the start of what was going to become a tradition. And since we're at Christmas lecture number 2, it is now a tradition. So thank you. It was really great to see this room pretty much absolutely full about 20 minutes before the start time, and to have that buzz of conversation, which suggests that our lecturer tonight is going to go down well. I'll say a little bit more about Tony in a minute. So this is the Leverhulme Centre for Anthropocene Biodiversity Christmas Lecture. I'm going to call it LCAB, as we do in the university, to save a few words. So LCAB was introduced in 2019 with a 10-year funding mandate from the Leverhulme Trust. Now, the Leverhulme Trust is known for its creativity as a funder. It looks beyond the norm. It follows brilliant and intriguing ideas. It breaks boundaries across academic disciplines. It's not driven by short-term impacts or other instrumental calculations. In other words, it's an absolutely brilliant funder. And we're delighted to be working with them in hosting LCAB. So LCAB brings together a vibrant community of PhD students, postdoc, research associates, fellows, and senior academics from across a host of different disciplines, departments, and faculties at the University of York, as well as the centre's partners at the Université de Sherbrooke in Montreal, St Andrews in Scotland, UCL, and the Stockholm Environment Institute. So how does LCAB break boundaries? Well, we live in a time of intertwined social and environmental challenges, and LCAB's research examines how the relationship between humanity and the natural world is changing. And it does this in a distinctive way. Of course, it acknowledges biodiversity losses, but LCAB also recognises gains and opportunities, thereby challenging the doom and gloom narrative that can sometimes stifle innovative responses. Now, that can be a controversial space, and LCAB has been involved in 1 or 2 controversies over the last few years. But through interdisciplinary research and creative engagement with its stakeholders, the Centre's researchers are delivering an optimistic, empowering agenda that can help to safeguard biodiversity while meeting the needs of people in ways that are inclusive, equitable, and just. And that's an absolutely appropriate background to be introducing our speaker this evening, Dr. Tony Juniper, CBE. Tony is a very prominent environmental figure, chair of the British government's official conservation agency, Natural England, and a fellow with the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. His books include the multi-award-winning What Has Nature Ever Done for Us? And Harmony, which was co-authored with His Majesty King Charles III. His latest book, Just Earth, explores the topics of his lecture this evening. It is available in all good bookshops, and signed copies, as Lindsay said, will be available to buy afterwards through Fox Lane Books, a brilliant and local independent bookseller. So Tony will argue that in a time of climate and nature crises, the answer to how people can lead good lives without ultimately hastening global collapse lies in fairness. He'll present his vision that for real, lasting and positive change, we need to address the ever-widening gaps between rich and poor, and the powerful and the weak. Green technologies won't do it all on their own, and in order to save and restore the natural systems which sustain society, the economy and civilization, it's vital that we break the traps set by inequalities. Drawing on interviews with globally renowned experts, as well as his own 40 years of experience of research, influence, campaigning and advocacy, Tony will explain how we can all play a part in shaping our environment for future generations. So will you then please join me in welcoming Tony to give this LCAB lecture.
Well, good evening, everybody. So nice to see you all, and so wonderful to be back in this beautiful historic city of York, and indeed this marvellous and beautiful historic building, which I'm told was built in 1415, which, if nothing else, gives us a sense of the march of history and how there are things around us in our everyday lives that are centuries old and may be a good inspiration to think about the kind of legacy that we will be leaving centuries hence. And one of the things that has occupied my attention now for more than 4 decades is the environmental legacy that we are leaving through the actions and the choices that we take in the 2020s. And anyone paying attention to the basics of this will know that we have something of a serious problem on our hands. The ever-rising concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the record temperatures that are now being recorded almost every year, and the momentum behind all of that, meaning that we're now committed to some really quite serious climate change over the coming period. Even if we do manage to reduce emissions very quickly now. Alongside that, and although less prominent, perhaps even more serious, is the damage that's taking place to natural systems, from deforestation to the bleaching of coral reefs, through to the loss of natural grasslands and woodlands across the temperate zones. We're seeing a steady decline in the state of nature in terms of the abundance of wildlife. Certainly where I live in East Anglia, we don't even see blackbirds very much anymore, never mind things that used to be there. And of course, the loss of species as documented by the IUCN Red Lists, which every time they publish a new one highlighting extinction risk, the list gets ever longer. So we know that this is a major set of challenges, and we know increasingly that this has implications in the human world. We used to spend a lot of time in the belief that looking after nature somehow was hostile to economic development and human well-being. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. And the extent to which we have sought to embed challenges, partly because of that, but also because of some deeper issues that I'll speak about this evening, we are not making the progress needed. Indeed, if you go back to the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, I was there working with Friends of the Earth, we knew then, and it says in the treaty, we need to embark on a program of emissions reductions. Here we are, 33 years later, and emissions now are 60% higher than they were back then, and since the Rio Summit, we have emitted into the atmosphere as much greenhouse gases as was the case through all of human history up until the early 1990s. So this is a problem that we have not addressed in any meaningful sense, and probably you could say that because of those treaties and because of what countries have done, it's less bad than it would have been, and that's probably true. But we are nowhere near where we need to be in getting emissions to zero very quickly and to embark on the process of restoring natural systems at scale, which we talk about a lot but are not yet investing in. What's this got to do with social inequalities? Well, over many, many years of wrestling with all of these subjects, it struck me that something was going badly wrong at a deeper level, because we have now a great deal of evidence, we have a great deal of research to confirm the nature of the challenge in terms of the imbalances being created in the climate system and the loss of nature. And yet these trends, year on year, are still getting worse. This year we expect to be the year of highest emissions in human history, after last year was the second highest and the year before that was the third highest. So we're still travelling at some pace in a direction which is not advised by the science. And over a long period, it struck me that actually, in the end, this is not really about an absence of data to prove the scale of the problem. It's not really about the lack of technologies or indeed the policy ideas and the business models we could deploy. This is something deeper, and it is to do with social conditions, I have concluded. And this is seen in the massive disparities that exist worldwide between those who control a lot of wealth and those who have nothing, the difference between those people who have a lot of influence and those who have no voice at all, between those people who are as yet unborn and the people living now, and of course there's a racial dimension to all of this too. And the more I thought about all of this, I thought actually this is the real issue. It's different kinds of social inequality which are preventing us from moving to where we need to move very quickly, and also those social inequalities are exacerbating the impacts of what are now unavoidable changes. And that led me to write this book, Just Earth, published earlier this year, and drawing on, as Charlie kindly said, a lot of interviews with experts, including a couple of them in this room this evening, Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, based here in the University of York, a great deal of published literature, and also quite a lot of eyewitness accounts from my own work over a long period. And one of those eyewitness accounts concerns work that we did at Friends of the Earth back in the 1990s to try and do something about toxic pollution being released into the environment. And we set up a campaign that we called Factory Watch. This involved us spending a lot of time trying to convince the British government agencies, at the time, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Pollution, to share with us data that they were collecting at taxpayers' expense, which pertained to the release of certain chemicals coming from certain industrial plants around the country. And they said, no, you can't have it, it's confidential, and we're not sharing it. So we went through various routes and got our lawyers involved and run some campaigns calling for the release of the data, and we finally got it. And this was in the mid-1990s, and we thought what we can do with this, with the new technologies we have available, is create one of the first internet-based pollution inventories in the world, which is what it was. We called it Factory Watch. And basically, if you were a member of the public, you could put in your postcode and you would be presented on a screen with a series of dots, broadly a 20-mile radius around your house, and it would tell you what pollution was coming from what source and what the name of the company was. And this we published, and it created a big stir, because for the first time, people could see what substances that could potentially harm their health were being released by businesses, in some cases on their doorstep. Cancer-causing pollution, endocrine-disrupting pollution, and the quantities of those materials that were being released that had to be licensed. And so we did this, and it got a lot of impact locally amongst communities, as you could imagine. And we decided that what we would do is build a campaign to try and put pressure on those companies to reduce that pollution, having exposed the fact of it occurring close to where people live. And as we began to put that campaign together, we discovered a very interesting thing, because what we did, we took that postcode level data and we overlaid it with the index of multiple deprivation across the country, and we discovered that 4/5 of the pollution was in the 1/5 of the country where the people were the poorest. And this struck us as being politically of enormous interest, because what it revealed is how the poorest people, i.e. the people with generally lower education, less confidence, they have no political voice, this was the place where the pollution went. And that, of course, revealed how it is possible, even in a country like ours, where we have a lot of awareness around environmental issues, and most people would like pollution to be stopped, and if you put it on the doorstep of educated people, it wouldn't happen. This revealed how that particular social inequality basically facilitated environmental pollution on that scale, continuing, because the people who it was next to didn't really feel as though they could do very much about it. And so we ran a campaign to empower the local community. We equipped them with facts, with information about the regulators, and actually this did lead, we were surprised, this did lead to a very dramatic reduction in pollution across the country, simply by shining a light on what was going on and letting everybody know the reality of what was occurring. But at the same time, quite a lot of that pollution, of course, was being exported. It was being sent away from here, not because people were concerned particularly about pollution, but because more money could be made by transferring those factories to places with lower environmental standards and lower wages on the other side of the world. And so the problem increasingly became a global one. And, you know, in that period in the 1990s, there was a big discussion about globalization and environmental issues, and one of the trends that we could see was the absence of any global frameworks that were really making a difference at ground level, leading to pollution searching for the cheapest places and inevitably the poorest places in which to place their polluting industries. And of course, in that same period, we were becoming aware of another massive injustice being perpetrated at the global level in relation to the release of greenhouse gases. And of course, this is something that's been well documented and people have written extensively about this. But the disparity between the pollution being caused in the richer Western countries compared with those that are still emerging and beginning to equip people with even the most rudimentary basics of life, the difference between those two is absolutely immense. And in the book, I review one study which compared the emissions of the East African country of Burundi and the United States. And just think of an individual citizen in Burundi and an individual citizen in the United States. The difference between them is 500-fold, would you believe? 500 times more pollution from an average US citizen compared with an average citizen of Burundi. And if you think about that for a moment, people in Burundi, no electricity, no heating, very low car ownership, not much gadgetry in terms of all of the things that we have in our homes, like dishwashers and everything else, no air conditioning. In the United States, heating, air conditioning, multiple vehicles, access to aeroplane travel, multiple gadgets, plus a meat-rich diet, and you add all that together and you see the difference, and the difference is absolutely staggering. And if you look at those figures in a more global sense, you realise that the top 10% of the global population is responsible for about half of the emissions going into the atmosphere presently, and at the other end it's kind of a mirror image of that, with 50% of the poorest people in the world, so the bottom half of humanity, being responsible for about 10% of emissions. It's absolutely vast. And if you delve into the top 1% and the top 0.1%, the figures become astronomical in terms of the per capita emissions. And of course, these emissions are leading to consequences. Last year, we went above 1.5 degrees of global average temperature increase compared with the pre-industrial period, and that is only going to go up as we head further into the 21st century, and this is leading to a very significant series of events. And 20 years ago, if you wanted to find out about climate change, you may have needed to read an IPCC report. These days, you can either look out of the window or switch on the news, because we're in it, and it's causing really quite devastating effects across the globe. But what you will notice is that the impacts of drought, of severe flooding and rainfall, of sea level rise, of immense storms, these impacts are falling highly disproportionately on the world's poorest people. And having travelled quite extensively over the years to places where these stresses and strains are becoming more obvious, I've been really struck by the extent to which the ramifications that arise from this are really quite surprising. During the course of writing Just Earth, I spent some time speaking to the Environment Minister of the Maldives. You might know the Maldives as a country of about 500 atolls, coral atolls, scattered across the central Indian Ocean. Some people call it a small island state. People live there, they call it a large ocean state. And they have a population concentrated on a few islands with scattered communities across some of the others. And trying to hold that country together is hard enough in the best of times, but now as the effects of global heating begin to ramp up, the country is facing really quite major challenges. And the Environment Minister explained to me about how the sea level rise is causing the freshwater aquifers on most of the inhabited islands now to be infused with salt water, which means they have no drinking water anymore, which means they have to spend fortunes on desalination. The islands are being hit by more severe storms more frequently, which means money is now being spent on sea defences on the inhabited islands. And their principal asset for the country, for the economy, both for food, for sea defences and for tourism, namely the country's incredible coral reefs. That particular asset is now in a state of what they believe is terminal decline. It's being hit repeatedly by high temperatures, also the ocean turning more acidic as a result of CO2 being absorbed into the ocean, and this is causing the reefs to begin to die back, and this is a massive hit to their economic system. And she explained to me that the cost of desal, sea defences, and the declining revenues which will come in the wake of the coral reefs dying off places a massive problem on the country's budget, because they would like to spend money on health and on education and on institution building, but they find they're having less and less budget available for that, as they need to spend more and more defensively on being able to keep the country going as the climate changes. And so this was really quite a stark reminder for me about the political implications of this, because for that country, it's an emerging democracy, and she's very worried that they won't have a democracy for very much longer because people will be very unhappy, and this will then lead to there being civic unrest, which will make the political situation unstable. And this is an example of a global inequality, with the richer countries putting that pollution into the atmosphere, with the effects of that falling upon poor communities, and that then being something which has a political consequence to it. And similarly across Africa, having travelled in various places and seen the effects of global heating, including in the cocoa landscapes of Ivory Coast in West Africa, I was there a few years ago researching a different project, and met cocoa farmers there who were finding that the extreme heat they now experience nearly every year, coupled with declining rainfall, which is partly linked to global climate change, but also local climate change caused by deforestation, these people are finding that they can no longer make enough money from cocoa growing, and so they're departing, going to the cities to see if they can get a job in a restaurant or being a taxi driver. And some of those communities, they told me that their young men are leaving and heading out across the Sahara Desert to head to Libya in order to see if they can get on a boat coming to Europe. And you all know that story in terms of what that does to politics in European countries. And so again, a boomerang effect, with very poor people being hit hard by pollution, some of it historic, and then this leading to these social disruptions, which then have these ripples which go further afield. And during the course of Just Earth, I had a long conversation with the British Army General, Richard Nugent, and he told me a story which I recorded in the book, which is another example of that boomerang effect, and how we can find that these effects of climate heating working on the most vulnerable communities can then have a bounce back towards us. And he described work that he'd done for the British military as part of the coalition forces in Afghanistan, trying to understand the Taliban and where they were getting so much strength from. And he discovered that it was collapsing agriculture was the source of the Taliban's military strength. And this was down to the snows in the Hindu Kush mountains, which decades ago used to melt in the spring, giving a gentle flow of water that lasted some months. Now, there's less snow to start with, and it melts very quickly, causing a flood, followed by a drought, which means that agriculture in many valleys is no longer viable. These people are destitute, they are desperate, and they were recruited by the Taliban. $5 a day is what the general discovered they were being paid, and $50 if they killed a coalition soldier. And this, of course, is a climate impact distant from here, hitting very poor people, but coming back at us in really quite an unpleasant way, and also a way in which not many people still seem to appreciate in this country, or indeed some of the other coalition partners. That context was never really explained. Closer to home, we can find serious inequalities not only in relation to exposure to pollution and its consequences, whether that's toxic pollution or greenhouse gases. And again, this is a global phenomenon, but we can see faces of this in this country, is the unequal access to green space. And so we know from a vast amount of data and evidence that if you have access to good quality green spaces, nice woods with bird song, and if you can walk by a beautiful river or walk by the seaside, it is really good for you. It's really good for your psychological health, There's a vast body of data which confirms this, and it also means you're more likely to go outside and take physical exercise, which means it's also good for your physical health. Access to those kinds of amenities is very far from equal, however. And if you look across the world, there are many examples of where it is the better off, and in countries in the West, the white people have more access to those kinds of places. And of course, this is reflected in house prices where people can afford to live, but is a major issue for all of society because, of course, the consequences of ill health, psychological ill health, anxiety, depression, physical inactivity, type 2 diabetes, for example, this is costing us all a fortune. And if you start to look into some of the numbers concerning the consequences of those long-term chronic health conditions for our health service, they are really quite troubling. And indeed, some think that type 2 diabetes later this century might actually bankrupt the National Health Service. And if you look at the prescription of antidepressants, it's rocketing upwards as people feel more anxiety in the kind of society that we live in at the moment, which is, of course, in this country quite unequal. And that set of pressures in terms of lack of access to green space collide with these health pressures, and this then translates into an economic as well as a social conundrum for our country. And one wonders when the penny will drop and we will understand that investing in green space in cities in particular is going to give us a big payback, especially if we can locate access to those green spaces in those localities where people presently have least ability to enjoy those benefits. And some of the benefits, they're really quite surprising. There's one study I review in the book which looked at incidences of domestic violence in the United States, and you get much less domestic violence in those places with more trees. Quite an interesting fact, even when you account for some of the other social differences that are in the data. So this is really quite a profound thing, and of course is not only something which is of huge importance as we look at public health, but also if you think about the political mandate needed to lean into these huge global issues linked with nature decline, then we're going to need a lot of public backing for that. And if you look into the data again, you will see that those people most motivated to look after nature and who demonstrate pro-environmental behaviours in their lives, those are people who had access to nature when they were younger. And so a lot of children growing up in this country at the moment, a lot being said about child poverty. One of the things that we need to factor in is the poverty of access to beautiful green spaces where youngsters can enjoy nature, because that's going to be the source of our mandate in 20, 30, 40 years' time to be able to continue with the work that hopefully is getting underway now to repair the damaged threads of our life support system. And so this set of differences between those who are doing the polluting, those who are feeling the consequences, those enjoying a good life, those living in blighted conditions, this is the backdrop against which the world has sought over more than 30 years now to come to a global consensus about what we're all going to do about this, what agreements are going to be adopted, what targets are going to be set. And having been to a great many of those COPs, going back to Rio and visiting many of them since, including Paris in 2015, and having covered the work of the Biodiversity Convention as well, I can tell you that beyond all the technical discussions that are going on there about targets, timetables, science, projections, who should do what, under what kind of rule-based scenario, the thing that's lying behind those technical discussions, which is slowing down progress, is the sense of injustice amongst those countries that are now emerging from periods of really quite grinding poverty. And those countries, they look at the West and they say, well, we don't really think it's fair for us to be reducing our pollution to zero as quickly as possible when you're carrying on doing what you've been doing for 200 years. Most of what's in the atmosphere you put there. We don't think it's really very fair for you to be telling us to cut our emissions to zero immediately. And so that's the backdrop to a lot of these conversations, that inequality that's baked in to the starting point of all of the countries that turn up to these negotiations. And I've noticed over many years of being involved in these subjects that there is a domestic face to this as well in terms of what goes on inside particular countries. And if you just think for a moment about some of the big environmental debates that have been raging here now, let's say over the last decade, what are they? Should we do low carbon electricity? Should we have more sustainable food? Should we clean up our rivers? Should we build loads of houses? And in all of these cases, what you find, it's not the only dimension of the discussion, but an important dimension of the discussion is to juxtapose the interests of the least well-off people with the environmental targets, and to conclude that by meeting the environmental targets, it's going to make things more expensive, therefore harm people on lower incomes, therefore we won't do it. Have you all heard that? We're not going to be protecting wildlife because we need to get on and build houses for hard-working families. Heard that one? We don't want to push water bills up too much because it's going to hurt hard-working families. We don't really wish to embark on this net zero program because it's going to hurt people on low incomes. And if we go down the route of sustainable or organic agriculture, it's going to make food more expensive, and therefore we should focus on providing people with what they need, which is cheap food now, which, by the way, doesn't serve the population at all well. It makes them sick, and it makes some of those health indicators worse. But that's the state of the discussion very often, is to see the interests of the poorest in society as being in a direct tension with the environmental goals, and the pushback on the environmental goals often is quite vigorous and often quite successful. Rarely, if ever, do we find the question of social inequality inserted into these discussions about environmental ambition. And instead, we find that there is this trade-off presented whereby the health and well-being of the public is seen to be something which needs to be protected above the protection of the environment, never mind its restoration. However, and as I've said a moment ago, it's those very poor people who are on the receiving end of the flooding, the storms, the pollution, the poor diets, and lack of places to go to enjoy wildlife. So it's really quite an interesting juxtaposition of two massive factors: inequality on the one side, unsustainable exploitation of the natural environment on the other. And until we put these two things together in a more meaningful way, it seems to me that we're not going to have a lot of chance of meeting these big global environmental challenges, including through what individual countries will do to help meet them. So recognising that we've got this inequality problem, and it is a very serious problem, and during the course of my work with Natural England, I get to travel across this beautiful country and see many different corners of it, and there are some pockets of real poverty that are here in our own country. And this is something which is now seen across the world. It's no longer the fact that the big differences are necessarily between rich and poor countries. It's between the elites and the rest of the population in many countries that you see the biggest differences. And that seems to be something which doesn't invite or doesn't stimulate a lot of conversation. Instead, we focus on poverty rather than inequality. And as we focus on poverty, rather than looking at how we might design our society better, instead we focus on the big solution to all of these issues of poverty, which is economic growth. This is what we're going to do. We're going to grow the economy. We're going to generate more tax revenues. We're going to make the country wealthier. And through that route, people at the bottom of society will be lifted up, and thereby we will be able to do all the things that we want to do, including dealing with these environmental issues, because we know that in richer societies, those things are more on the agenda. So that's the broad storyline that goes behind economic growth. What is less often talked about is the extent to which this idea of trickle-down economics in the real world is fantasy. And if you look at the World Bank, and the idea of trickle-down is that if we grow the economy, people will become richer, including at the top, and the benefits of that will go down to the bottom of society. There are many data sets out there which reveal the extent to which this is not really a true picture of how things are, including the World Bank's 2022 World Inequality Report, whereby they present data from 1996 to 2021, in which they look at the relative allocation of all of the trillions of dollars of wealth that were created over that quarter century via the idea of economic growth. Would you believe that 38% of those trillions of dollars went to the 1% of already richest people in the world, and the bottom 50% of humankind shared out 2% of those trillions between them? Massive concentration at the top of societies as a result of the ways in which we are presently pursuing economic growth in the form of GDP, an idea which took hold really in the years after the Second World War. And the economists who invented this, they said, what you must not do, you must not use this as a measure of overall progress. But of course, it being a simple single number, is it going up? How much is it going up? It took on enormous attraction for the commentators and the politicians and the markets. And so we became wedded to this idea of growing GDP. And there's two problems with it, one of which I've already mentioned, and that is the extent to which growth in GDP tends to concentrate wealth unless there are some serious checks and balances placed around it, and the extent to which, of course, it is the principal driving force behind environmental damage globally. And think about that for a second, and where do we get growth from? Well, one place we get growth from is building and construction. And you will have noticed over recent years, going back many years actually, this constant refrain that if we're going to build to achieve growth, we've got to get rid of these pesky environmental rules that are holding everything back. This is at a time when we know there's an emergency upon us, and yet the growth priority pushes these things to the margin. And so you can see it there in the built development dimension of growth. The other place, of course, where we put a lot of effort into growth is through mass consumerism and having more and more stuff. And that, of course, is in the end derived from materials that are being taken from nature, whether it's forests being cut down to make paper and cardboard, or minerals mined from beneath a rainforest to make some more of these kind of devices, or whether it's the fossil fuels being extracted to make more plastic. The growth machine, as seen in consumerism, really has now got superchargers attached to it. Because it's not only us now, as was the case in the 1960s and 70s, in the West that take all this for granted. It's now a global phenomenon. And if you look at the consumption of natural resources, minerals, fossil fuels, including for petrochemicals and plastics as well as energy, minerals and the proceeds of the manufacture of ores and the material needed to do all of that, the amount of stuff consumed between 2000 and 2016 globally was about equivalent to all of that material that we used during the entire 20th century. So we've compressed into a decade and a half a global environmental footprint that took an entire century to appear in the 20th century. And so the profile of consumption is going dramatically upward. And a large part of it, of course, is this spreading of consumerist cultural values that are now in pretty much every corner of planet Earth. In 2020, for the first time ever, we passed the point where in a single year we extracted 100 billion tons of natural resources from the environment. That's an awesome figure. If you divide that by 8 billion, you start to generate some estimates as to what the per capita demand is globally. But of course, and as is the case with the greenhouse gases, there is a big skew towards the already developed countries. But this consumerism has got an inequality dimension baked into it as well, because one of the big drivers that causes people to buy stuff is the difference between their predicament and what they see better off people owning. There's a kind of an anxiety to keep up with people who seem to be doing better than you are, and this works at all levels of society. Even amongst the billionaires, there's yacht envy. They're trying to get 2 helicopter pads on their yacht compared with 1, because that's how you show you're successful. And that psychology trickles right down to the bottom of our society, with people scraping a living, unable to feed themselves properly or to pay for their heating, but they still got an eye on the consumer goods. And it's very telling that the advertising industry, which is a big piece of the machinery that enables that consumerism to grow as it has, that works much better in more unequal societies where you have more anxiety with people feeling as though they're not keeping up, and therefore the effect of advertising is all the more potent. And in those kinds of circumstances where you have these massive disparities between people who appear to be doing very well and have a lot of good stuff and people who feel neglected, they feel disrespected, they feel anxious, they feel quite angry, this of course is a perfect bed for political anger to be channeled towards different kinds of new political movements. And if you look at what's happened in the United States recently, where a group of billionaires have seized control of the country with a lot of votes from poor working class people behind them, you understand how that dynamic can work in practice. And unfortunately, the United States is not the only country where this is visible. It's economic inequality, exclusion, leading to anxiety and anger. The consumerism backdrop is a part of it, and then this can lead to places that a few decades ago we may have thought seemed quite unlikely in the Western world in the relatively near future. So this is the many connections that exist between social inequalities and difference and the challenges that we face in being able to fix these big environmental problems. And I do in the book, you'd be pleased to know, go into some of the things that we might wish to look at in fixing this. And I come with a kind of a manifesto in here, which is about a just transition and how we're going to simultaneously fix social inequalities at the same time as environmental challenges. I'll give you a few of the headings. We need, number one, we need to replace GDP with a genuine progress indicator. This can be done. I'm quite skeptical about artificial intelligence, but I asked ChatGPT the other day, I said, can you calculate me some figures to replace GDP with genuine progress? Yes, no problem, it said. We've got all that data. We know about inequality, we know about happiness, we know about ill health, we know about greenhouse gas emissions, we know about resource consumption. We can put it all together and we can give you a number. And I think that would be quite powerful if we were pursuing growth in something other than GDP. Can we have growth in genuine progress so that people are happier, they live longer, they have more education, their communities are stronger, the environment they live in is more healthy and more beautiful? We can grow all of that. We have the data. Why don't we change the metrics and start growing that instead? Number two, how about we replace the governance structures for private sector companies, which are now hugely out of date? They were set up to generate value for shareholders. That may have been good in the 16th and 17th century. This is now the 21st century. We need companies to harness their creativity, their inventiveness, their innovation to solve massive problems of social and environmental decline. That should be the governing objective for private sector companies, to improve the state of society and to improve the state of the environment. You can still make a profit, but that is the means to an end, not the end in itself. Wealth will still be created, but business will be harnessed to a different set of more pressing challenges, which are here now in a way that they weren't when those company structures were first designed. We can change the way finance works. Pension funds investing in anything that is going to cut off the ability to deal with climate change or nature decline, that just seems like madness to me. I mean, these are funds that are explicitly investing for the well-being of people who in their 20s and 30s are putting in money that they will spend in their 60s, 70s and 80s. If there's no world when they get to their 60s, 70s and 80s, that doesn't seem like a very sound investment strategy. We've got to harness the trillions of pounds that are presently in the pension funds, the insurance companies, the hedge funds and the banks. It needs to be deployed at scale to bring forward solutions. We can use government subsidies to help de-risk some of that. Trillions of dollars is spent globally every year propping up fossil fuels and industrial agriculture. Let's spend that in ways which is going to create the foundations of a clean energy revolution and sustainable farming that can feed everybody into the future indefinitely. Let's think about ways in which we might protect the interests of future generations. This is something that's been done in Wales with the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, which basically requires all Welsh government departments and public bodies to look at the interests of people not yet born before they decide on a particular choice. This has led to there being no new open cast coal mines in Wales, because obviously that would limit future generations' ability to deal with climate change. So I've got these kinds of ideas there: ecological taxation and indeed fairer taxation more broadly, whereby we can begin to tax the amount of pollution and waste that's created rather than taxing income, beginning to find ways of really changing behaviour through a clear financial signal. All of that, I think, is doable, and it's possible to write a programme that can deal with these twin crises as interconnected and two faces of the same problem, rather than as now in a rather chaotic way where they're seen as two different things that rarely meet. If we're going to do that, we're going to need more than a manifesto. We are going to need a broad-based movement to do this. And actually, I take inspiration at the end of Just Earth from some of the people who created the world we presently live in. Because the neoliberal, capitalist, small government, deregulatory world that we now inhabit, it's not a force of nature or a fact of life. This is something that was invented by people. And if you look at the ideas that we now assume as mainstream ways in which we run our society, these were fringe ideas in the 1960s and 70s, but people got together, they worked through universities, through think tanks, through the columns of newspapers to build a movement that said actually things can be different. And in this book, considering the breadth of the story that's there, we need something very different, I conclude. We're not going to find solutions through the kinds of ideas that enabled societies to thrive in the 20th century with communism, socialism, or capitalism. I say we need a new idea. I call it thrivalism. This is about 8 billion people thriving together on a living planet through adopting a different approach towards what progress could and should be. That's the kind of vision that brought us to the world we live in now. It's the kind of vision, I think, that may take us to a different world in the 20s, 40s, 50s and 60s if we put our mind to it. Thank you very much indeed for listening. Very happy to take a few questions if there are any. Thank you.